to Film Trace. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production, all the way to release and reception. It is just Chris and me today. Chris, it was your choice. What did you choose?
Yeah, I guess it was a choice.
Wait, what does that mean? I'm confused. We have free will, right?
Yeah, we do. It's definitely not fate, but I don't know. I feel like maybe it's just the sheer fact that I feel a little guilty for choosing this one because I knew it would be a lot, and I knew that it maybe wouldn't be very fun, but it just kind of felt like a compulsion that I like just like, oh yeah, we got to do that. It is,
but why though?
let me see if I can muster up a decent answer. It is Joe and Anthony Russo's Cherry, their first foray into movie making since Avengers Endgame 2 years ago, and basically, well, first of all, for those that don't know, because the I don't know, the marketing of this movie was crap.
Ridiculous. Yeah, totally ridiculous. Made no sense.
Yeah. And honestly, I don't think I really understood what it was about until somebody told me it was based on a book. And so then I just looked up what the book was about. So it's based on an autofiction novel, which is like a kind of new craze in the publishing world, where basically they give free reign to people that have had interesting real life experiences, but also in that free reign give them the opportunity to dramatize and embellish whenever and wherever possible, to make it as, you know, as fun of a read, as entertaining as a read as you possibly can.
That's so bizarre because I didn't know what that term was when I saw it, and I looked it up on Wikipedia. I was like, isn't that just what a memoir is?
Yeah, exactly.
Ways, right? So like, I guess it's more freedom to make stuff up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And, you know, I think that the term has kind of finally become socially acceptable because there was that thing in the 2000s, right, with James Fry and Million Little Pieces. Yeah, exactly. Anyways, what's this one about? It's written by a Iraq War vet named Nico Walker, and it is his quote-unquote story. The blog line is the wild journey of a disenfranchised young man from Ohio who meets the love of his life only to risk losing her through a series of bad decisions and challenging life circumstances, which is one of the worst log lines we've had so far, because those quote bad decisions and challenging life circumstances include everything from signing up for the war for basically no reason, and becoming addicted to oxy and heroin, and turning to a life of crime, robbing banks. Yeah. So it's a lot. And it's especially a lot for the kind of layup effort from the guys that have well, I guess not anymore because the Avatar re-release has officially usurped them again, right?
Oh yeah.
But for a while, for a good minute, they had the biggest blockbuster of all time in cinematic history. Why the hell would they do this for their but like their next release? And I was just kind of fascinated by that. And so that's kind of where my compulsion lied, is like, you make the biggest movie ever, and then you decide to go to Apple TV, and you know, the only thing in common between the MCU and this is Tom Holland, and that's pretty much where the similarities end.
Yeah, and like, are you a big MCU person?
You know, I hate to say it, but I was for a long time. I grew up reading comic books, and so that kind of definitely scratched an itch for me for quite a minute. But I don't know, right around the time of like Infinity War, I say, is where I started losing interest.
It's just a lot to take on.
Yeah.
To be a fan. That's like a big investment.
It felt like it ended up feeling like a chore, like a obligation more than a exciting thing to come back to over and over again. So
if you think about it, like, these guys had free reign to do this movie, right? Like, if they're doing Infinity War, Endgame, and sure, like, Endgame may have got beaten up by Avatar, but like, if you put Infinity War and Endgame together, which they probably, you know, on some level should be, they're like makers of one of the biggest movies ever, essentially. Why do you think they chose to do something like that? I think they were bored or something. Like the MCU really does rein in people, don't they? From what I've heard.
Exactly. And I mean, I think that's the other reason I was interested in getting into this, is because I think the big question mark behind the Russos is, basically where they came from and how did they end up getting the biggest franchise in history. And I think the answer lies specifically in television. They were TV guys for decades, and they pretty much became effortless constructionists of something that was already built for them by other people, right? So they directed huge runs of Arrested Development, for which they won an Emmy, Community, Happy Endings, like lots of great shows, but where the direction of those individual episodes didn't really mean anything more than, following a guidebook that had already been set up by the creators and showrunners, right?
Yeah, definitely.
And so, like, they're really good rule followers, essentially.
Well, that's why they work well in the MCU.
Exactly.
Right? Because if you can follow the studio template with, what's his name, Feige,
Right.
Then you're going to do well. They definitely, they want to play ball, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're not experimental artists going out there trying to make something that's going to like push the envelope. But then you get this movie, Cherry. The first 20 minutes of this, I honestly had no idea what this was when you chose it. And when I put it on, I was like, I know Tom Holland's in it. I had no idea the Russo Brothers directed it at all. I knew it was on Apple TV, so that's like, it's kind of going to be pretty good, or at least high quality. And I turned on, I was like, this is insane. Like, the tone of this movie, when it starts out, you're like, this is just nuts.
I think you mean tones plural.
Yeah, well, that we'll get into that too when we talk about the conception of it. But it really is. It's almost like it feels like for the Russo Brothers that this is a career restart. This movie, they want to sort of make their stamp and basically say, "Hey, we're not just these studio guys. We're not just the MCU guys. We can do this really interesting. It's high art. That's what they're trying to do, right? It's like art film."
Yeah.
And when you're trying to do that after you come off of something like Infinity War and Endgame, I think it's a pretty tough transition to make. Now, you do see some flourishes of that, like on the Community episodes they directed. I think they did did they do the paintball ones?
Yeah, I think so.
So, like, there's some elaborate sort of interesting stuff there, but nothing. I don't really know that much about the early career, like Welcome to Collinwood, You Mean Dupree. What is You Mean Dupree? Is that Owen Wilson movie?
yeah. Like,
wait, what?
They were comedy guys.
How do these guys get Winter Soldier?
Right. So it's like that solid decade between You, Me, and Dupree and Winter Soldier, where they like basically flash their chops in the television world.
Yeah. That's nuts.
That they basically there's two things I want to make sure to mention right at the get-go as kind of my thesis statement for what the hell is going on with Cherry. Number one, it's a homecoming film, right? Like, they clearly had some kind of personal connection with the original text, being based on the story of a guy from the middle of nowhere, Ohio, which is where they're from. And the only reason they really got their career started is because they put together a movie all on their own, kind of going back to our Swingers episode, just credit cards and student loans, except without, the rich friend of the dad. And so, like, these guys are like even more homegrown than the average filmmaker that we cover here on Film Trace, which is crazy to think about considering where they're at now. But literally, this movie that they made, Pieces, back in 1998, still unreleased. It just made it on the festival circuit. It never got a distributor, but it did catch the attention of Steven Soderbergh, who then gave them a wad of cash to make Welcome to Collinwood, a completely forgettable 2002 kind of like mob comedy. And so, but like, just through sheer persistence and ingenuity and the crowd-pleasing aesthetics of their style, managed to carve out a career for themselves. And so then here's where my second prong of my thesis comes in. They wanted to come back home, so to speak, which makes sense for anybody who's homegrown and has moved to Hollywood. But also, I kept coming back to it, and I was solidified in my argument. Basically, when Tom Holland's character is in basic training before the Iraq War, and he just straight up says in his sardonic voiceover, "Don't join the fucking army." And that immediately made me think of all of the news stories that were circulating, especially in the aftermath of Endgame, and also it kind of started flaring up with Captain Marvel, which they didn't direct, but they once again they're following the rules. And one of the main rules they had to follow to the letter with all of their MCU movies is to present the military-industrial complex of the United States in a favorable light.
Oh god, yeah. Empire movies, empire building movies.
Exactly. And so I have to feel like, and I tried reading around. I feel like maybe you did more research on the actual film than me this time around. So I'd be curious to see if you came across this at all. But I haven't seen anybody mention the fact that this feels like their chance to give the middle finger to the U.S. Army that had basically held them hostage for these last several movies. And to finally just come out and say, fuck the U.S. Army. But in the context of this kind of coming home, opioid crisis epidemic sheen. I don't know. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. Yeah, because I'm just I can't believe their career. It's so bizarre. Because this is the first movie they've had a real budget where their hands weren't tied behind their back.
Right.
Like there was originally $100 million movie, then for some reason got cut down to $40 million. I'm not sure why, because they're going to shoot it in Cleveland. They didn't have enough money or something. Then they shoot it in Los Angeles, and then they lost their budget. They lost $60 million of their budget, so it became a $40 million movie, which is tough to make a movie like this on $40 million.
Right.
But they did have sort of free reign to do what they want in sort of a feature film, and this is what they decided to do. It's funny you mentioned the political side of this, because I didn't even pick up on it, because, I think the Iraq War, especially, I guess we call it the Iraq War, the second Iraq War. Is that what we call it? I don't even know. I call it Iraq War 2. Yeah.
Right.
Has such a negative connotation in our society. Mm-hmm. There's not a lot of people waving flags being like, yeah, I fought in the second Iraq War. It's just not a thing it doesn't feel like it comes up as a point of national pride.
Oh, no.
I think for a lot of people, it's a point of national embarrassment. When you think about how many people believed that Iraq was behind 9/11, that's a big reason why we invaded Iraq. Well, of course they weren't. They're all Saudi Arabian for the most part. It had nothing to do with Iraq. It's interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting perspective on that, because I just sort of take that as the norm. That the way we view the war and the PTSD, I think one of the biggest cultural takeaways from that war was, the mental illness that came back with the troops, the rate of suicide for people who served overseas. That to me was the big story. And what happened to Iraq? It completely fell into an abyss of civil war, after we invaded and sort of stuck around, but we couldn't stop the civil war from happening, essentially.
Right. Yeah.
But that is a really fascinating, because I did not think about that at all. And I didn't come across anything political in their video interviews that I went through on YouTube. And they did a lot of them for this one.
Right.
So the main interview people, it's always interesting to see who they get to put out front for the in-person interviews. And it was the Russo Brothers and Tom Holland were in 30 interviews.
Yep.
But I didn't see almost nothing about the politics, but it's so front and center when you think about it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's that's the main thrust of the film. Is bored dude has an issue, with his girlfriend at the time, is kind of existentially lost. Let me join the army. It's a really kind of tried and true story. Right. And then what happens afterwards? Do you really think that this to them is a Molotov cocktail almost?
That's the vibe I kept getting from the get-go. And I guess I knew going in after finding out about, the source material, that there was going to be this Iraq War Army vet PTSD connection, but I didn't realize how big that was going to play into the overall journey of the protagonist, right?
Yeah,
It seemed like in the marketing and in the interviews, that was just one component. If anything, it feels like the opioid crisis, in quote marks, was what they were trying to put what they were saying they were trying to put front and center.
yeah.
But you don't have the opioid epidemic without the Iraq War.
Yeah, that's
in
true.
many ways. So when you're going down to like, ground zero, sorry for the tasteless pun, but you have this ultimate repudiation of this system that lured in and just fucked over countless young men. And this guy who's also nameless, which I think is important, right, in the movie, even if that's kind of played out and I was like, ugh, whatever, in reaction to it, is, the classic, reading of that is that he's a stand-in for any possible army vet, right?
Yeah. It's funny you say that, because that's like, I had a note in the production where they talk about, in one of the interviews, they talk about like an overhead shot, and how they basically, it goes an overhead shot. The movie takes place in Cleveland, right in the middle of Ohio there. And like, here's the quote. He goes, we did some interesting shots that are overhead shots about all these homes in Cleveland. What we were really trying to say is that this is one person's story among millions.
Right.
So exactly what you're saying is that, like, he's supposed to be the everyman. That's interesting, because I don't know if this is a common experience for most Americans. I think they probably have some association with it. But I don't know. At the same time, they're trying to do this everyman thing, and this is a theme that comes up over and over again in their interviews and sort of how they conceived of this movie and the tone. But it's like, on the one hand, you have this palatable everyman story, and on the other hand, you have this super gritty, super specific story about Cleveland. And they're like, there's these two different sort of goals. They want it to be a clear story and a good movie. They say that over and over. They want it to be a good movie that you want to watch, but they also want it to be specific enough to have some sort of emotional sort of power and insight into this character. That's a very tough thing to do. And it's interesting, like, they talk about, in terms of what got them interested in this story and the book in the first place, the fact that they're the authors from Cleveland, they're from Cleveland. There's a great quote where Joe Russo says, it just comes from being from a city that's tough-nosed and in a dying industry. It's a city that, in a lot of ways, when you're there and you're younger, you feel like you lack forward momentum. And then it goes on to say, we understand the mentality of being from Cleveland, but we also understand how that sense of existential blight fuels the opioid crisis, and what makes the industrial Midwest basically ground zero for this crisis. So they're trying to do a lot, I think, what you gather, not only from the story aspects in the novel that they're trying to film, but also with the film techniques and the tone and how they shoot and the changing of aspect ratios and the changing of the tone of the film. It's pretty, I was going to say pretentious, but I don't think it's that pretentious. I think most of the reviewers and a lot of the reaction has been like, oh, this is super pretentious. That's what I get from most of the reactions, is that, like, they're trying to do too much. I think it's pretty, like, cool that they're going for it. And I think that rubs people the wrong way. Like how self-conscious the film is, in terms of trying different things and using the medium of film to create and different experiences for the viewer. It is on some level kind of feels a little bit on the experimental side, in terms of doing that. I don't know. I mean, what do you think about, like, the tone and going in terms of the conception of going into this movie and what they're trying to accomplish in terms of making it watchable, but also bringing something that is gritty and true? Do you think that works, or do you think that was like a failed endeavor?
Yeah, it's tough. I feel like out of all the movies we've covered for this podcast, this is the one that I am split about the most.
Yeah.
Because I totally get why it's gotten negative reviews. I totally get why it frustrated a lot of people. But like you said, there's something admirable, and there always, I think, is something admirable about swinging for the fences, even
Yeah.
even if you know, even if it's a foul ball left of center. You think that you have this clear story, single protagonist, journey, epic, but once you get into the tones, that's where then everything feels kind of messy. And also, like, the added aspect of it being both a war and drug movie, I can't think of too many instances where you have both so emphasized in a
Yeah.
script, and like both of those have so many tropes already laden within them throughout the course of film history that it's incredibly difficult to find new and interesting and watchable ways to do that without it feeling boring or trite. And the fact that they're able to pull that off, like, yeah, I was not engaged all the way through the film, and I definitely had to give myself a break from it, which is maybe a bonus to the streaming the proclivities of so many of these studios nowadays. But at the end of the film, as jostled as I was by its juggling of tones, I ultimately felt like, at least it got me thinking about stuff in a way where I was not wanting to give up on the film. Like, it was not trying to. It was both trying to push you away and pull you in at the same time, which is a very unusual thing for a film to do. Usually it's just focusing on one of those efforts, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why it doesn't come across as it's like melodramatic, but it's not in a way that's like overly self-indulgent. Because it's like when someone tells a melodrama and kind of goes all in and doesn't jostle the audience at all, it creates a very saccharine fake sense to the film and the story.
Mm-hmm.
But with this, I think the underlying story is very melodramatic and maybe saccharine. And of course it is, like the way it ends too. Like,
Yeah.
he gets out of prison and she's there. It's kind of ridiculous, but the way that they forced the subjective viewpoint on you, and they made clear that in terms of how they shot it, it was basically like, we're going to force you to have his perspective, which is, I think, easier to do when you're filming a book, because a book is the easiest way to force the subjective viewpoint on a reader, right?
Yeah.
And so they had that base material there, and they basically, let's just shove this in people's face and kind of replicate what his experience would look like in each stage of this story. And there's like 6 chapters to it, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as like I am an old curmudgeon, and I think, being a little bit too confident in your ability, especially in art, can be a very, very bad thing. But I always fall back on what, I don't know when he said this, but Tony Kushner, the playwright, said this, I think in some interview or when I saw him once. He basically said that like greatness is impossible without pretension, right? You can't create something great unless you're striving to do something different and amazing, and you're reaching towards greatness. If you reach towards greatness and you fail, you're called pretentious. But if you reach towards greatness and you get there, you're just called amazing. And it's the same act, essentially. It's either you land it or you don't. Here, I think with this film, it's kind of a mixed result.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a good movie. I'll put that right out there. I don't think it's a good film. I don't think it makes a lot of sense. I think the story they rely too much on those tonal shifts to tell the story.
Right.
And it becomes almost like vignettes attached together. And it does feel like different movies as you move from one chapter to the next. But there's something to be said for going for that.
Yeah.
And it kind of like, it makes me think of, the reaction to this, and we'll get to that a little bit later, is not being great. But I do kind of wonder how this film's going to be viewed in 10 years, 20 years, 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what are your kids going to think of this movie when they're our age? Is it going to be seen in a different way? And then, that's a very common tale with films like this. And I mean, is it doing well? I guess it's doing okay on streaming. A lot of people are watching it. It didn't really make much of the box office because the box office isn't really going right now for the most part. But I would say critically and stuff like that has not been a home run. But I do think the audaciousness of what they're doing will be rewarded down the line. And people will look back on this and be like, oh, like this was a really interesting way to present this story. And there's so many different flourishes in it that I feel like you're a film nerd or whatever. I can just see, someone who's super into film liking aspects of this, but hating the entire movie. You know what I mean? Like loving this scene or that scene and how he did this or how they did, they shot this or that, but hating the overall product. Right.
Right.
I just think it's one of those movies that it's ultimately the average person is probably going to hate, and I would never recommend this movie to most people. Like it's like the parent, like, would you recommend this to your mom?
No.
And you'd be like, no, right? Like it's like, would I recommend it to my sister? Probably not. But would I recommend it to like the film nerd friend I have in Nashville? Yes. Right, like it's 100% yes. Like you need to see this because it's a bold step more than anything. In terms of how this thing was shot, it was shot in Cleveland. What do we think about Holland's performance in this and bringing him on as such like as Spiderman? And we saw him before in What Is the Devil All the Time, where he played. I thought he was pretty good in that. What do we make of the decision for the Russo Brothers to bring him in? And then how do you think that played out?
I read a lot of reviews saying that people thought that Holland was one of the few highlights of the film. Yeah. And I don't think he was bad, but I also the guy had to do a very difficult kind of high wire act, considering all the tonal shifts and considering the extreme ends of the spectrum that this character experiences. Like I said, you rarely see an actor do both the drug addict and PTSD thing at the same time, and I can't imagine how difficult that must be. I mean, he did that interview with GQ UK in which he basically said he had no idea what being on drugs was like. He knew what a hangover was like, but he had to. The best thing that he could do to approximate it was some kind of like crazy supercharged energy shot that messed him up and made him feel like he had caffeine coursing through his veins immediately. But like, I don't know. It's one of those things where like, and I look back at the film, watching it a couple days ago, and the drug use scenes don't stand out to me. The war scenes that are incredibly traumatic, that perhaps are the basis for his PTSD, don't stand out to me either. I think the one thing that Holland does really well, that I think is kind of underplayed in the film, and I almost wished I got more of, was those quiet moments, including like at the end of the film. There is a actually really cool kind of setup and shot where he gives up and he wants to be caught because he hates this life, and he's standing in the middle of the street shooting his gun in the air, and then goes to the curb to shoot up with heroin one last time before the cops eventually find him. And like those quiet moments, and there's also some quiet moments with Sierra Bravo's character, who plays Emily, the love of his life, where I could like he did fit that everyman role really well. So while like the really emotional melodramatic pieces didn't really work for me, and I think Holland's not quite there as an actor. I mean, the dude's only 24. I do think that there's something special about him, and a reason why he's kind of been so successful. But it's more in those kind of calmer moments of the film, which I, like I said, wish there was more of, because there's so much chaos in this film. What do you think?
I mean, I think it works really well having him in there, and it was such a conscious choice. Mm-hmm. Like I think there's some quote in here by Joe Russo. After we read the book, we felt the only person who could play this and carry the correct level of empathy was Tom. And I do think that they had a problem, and they mentioned this, is that, they say that we knew the audience would have a difficulty with the lead. So we needed someone who was charming and empathetic to carry them through. The mission with Cherry was to make people have an emotional response to the material, not an intellectual response, is what Joe Russo said in GQ UK. I think that worked out really well because the character, I would say for the first 30 minutes, I found him to be extremely unlikable. Someone who, it's kind of like one of those tests is like, do I see any of myself in this person? Do I aspire to anything that this person is doing? And the first half hour of this movie, it's an absolute no. He's a jerk. He's super mean. He's violent. He's kind of stalker-y with the Emily. He just doesn't come across as a good person that you'd want to know or be close to. But as you get to know him more and more, I think Holland does have that natural charm to him where he makes this very unsavory character palatable, just like the Russo brothers wanted. And he really brings you in. I think by the end of it, I was like, yeah, like I feel something for him in his position, which I think is incredibly hard to do with this type of character. I mean, you think about it, he comes across in the beginning as just kind of like a bored, a little bit of a burnout who joins the U.S. Army because the girl that he loves is moving away. So he doesn't know what to do with himself. So he joins the Army. Then, does okay there, comes home, gets involved with drugs. That spirals out of control. Because that problem gets so bad, he starts robbing banks with a gun, putting a gun in people's faces, which is something reviewers brought up, how this movie sugarcoats the crimes that this person's committing. Like, he's literally putting people's lives in jeopardy. The one guy in the story, not to be a spoiler alert, because of doing the bank robbery, gets killed. They don't take him to the hospital. He basically dies because they don't take him to the hospital. He's not a good person.
Right.
But Tom Holland can sell it. And I think he sold it very well here in a way that I think worked really well for the film overall. But I think we're a little bit in the minority here. I kind of liked this movie. I liked what they tried to do. And it sounds like you have some affinity for it as well.
Yeah.
But critics hate this movie.
I know.
Like, they hate it. 37% on Rotten Tomatoes, a 52 out of 100. Terrible score. Top critics even lower, 32%. Metacritic's at a 44. Audience score is higher, 74% on Rotten Tomatoes. Letterboxd of a 50. This is the most surprising one to me, is a Letterboxd score. Letterboxd score of a 54. So the people who I think would be most into this, kind of the film nerds and snobs, hate this thing. A 50 on Letterboxd is pretty terrible overall. And IMDb is not that high either, at 66. Right. So, what do we make of the response here to this movie, especially among critics and kind of the art aficionado crowd? Why do you think it's been so negative?
It's tough to tell. I mean, one thing that really stood out to me, I don't have it on our notes, but Sheila O'Malley, who's one of my favorites for RogerEbert.com, made probably the just simplest salient point, is that this movie is essentially Goodfellas for war vets. And I think that that's a lot of the bad taste that was in my mouth for like the first, like you mentioned, the first 30 minutes are rough of this movie. And
very rough. Yeah.
Part of what makes it so difficult to digest and like kind of understand the weird amalgamation of tones that the Russos are clearly doing on purpose, but like we said, swinging for the fences and not really caring about where it lands. Or if they are, they have this very strict, personalized vision that is just not blending. And I think that comes from, them not really having a chance throughout their careers to develop their voice. In many ways, this is kind of like you said, this is kind of like their rebirth or this chance to start over. And so it's going to be messy. And so what do you do when you don't really have your own singular vision? You ape, you emulate. And so as any good Italian-born American that is trying to become an auteur would do, they look to Scorsese and see how he's able to keep that frenetic pace about bad people for sustained over the course of, a 2+ hour movie. And they kind of just went with that, and they tried to, like you said, added their flourishes. There's a Letterboxd review that is just the most liked Letterboxd review about this film. POV, you're inside Tom Holland's asshole, and like that's literally one of the shots in the film, and also it's a pretty clever metaphor for the film in general. That we're just trying to like understand and experience this guy's life inside and out, and yet we're just kind of seeing like navel gazing in action. Which is unfortunate because, like you said, there are some things that are really likable and admirable about the movie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the best criticisms of the film is that it does kind of just lump. It's like a stew of different sort of styles, which is on purpose. Like they even said that, they talk about each chapter of the film and making sort of the conception of what they're doing for each chapter. And they said the opening chapter of Falling in Love is magical realism. Basic training is absurdism. The war is absurdism meets horror. PTSD is horror. Drugs is a certain sense of irony and detachment. The incarceration is redemption. And so the character goes through all of these cycles over the course of the film. And we felt the best way to capture that was by making them as distinct as possible and then heightening them as much as possible. That's what Joe Russo said to EW. So I know it was such a self-conscious effort to do that. But I think one of the end results is sort of what Anne Hornaday says from the Washington Post. She says the result is a movie that feels like many films being shoehorned into one, here evoking Jarhead, there evoking Requiem for a Dream, but always keeping its emotional essence at a distance, obscured by ever more arresting technical flourishes. So it's like it really the crux of the movie lies within that conflict between imitation and sort of the emotional honesty of the film. I don't know. I guess I don't see that as the criticism. What I see like the main failure of this film is that it just doesn't work. And that it doesn't really land a coherent emotional narrative that really makes any sense at all.
Yeah.
It's back and forth. It's all over the place. It is super powerful in a lot of ways. But you don't end the story necessarily. It just feels so jumbled and assembled in a way that it doesn't have a through line. And I think, the more negative reviews, I think I would take like this one from Joe Morgenstern.
Oh, I hate him.
From Wall Street Journal. It's funny though. It's like, the quote is, no one is likable, let alone endearing or lovable, and nothing is understated ever, ever, ever. Watching the hero talk to the camera while robbing a bank, I wish he would just shut up and live his life without commenting on it. Responses like that and critics like that are pointless, right? Like he's not engaging with the film at all. I think what I think is missing from a lot of the reactions is the intent. And this is not just some random group of people doing this to make money. Like there is a very specific artistic intent. And when you read the interviews and you hear Tom Holland and you hear the Russo brothers, none of what they did was really on accident. And it's one thing to say, hey, it's a mess, it doesn't really work, which is what I'm saying. On the other hand, it's to say this is bad. I don't think that it's necessarily a bad attempt at doing a great movie. It's not a great movie, but I think the attempt was pretty amazing and phenomenal in some ways. And I think it will, in terms of their next movie and what Tom Holland does, it'll be kind of a marker in their careers and what they do with the rest of their work. But I think it's so easy to diminish a movie like this, and I think that's what I'm seeing with a lot of critics and some of the views are a little bit less harsh,
right?
But I think the critical viewpoint, it just seems really kind of condescending, if that makes sense,
and cynical. I feel too
very cynical, like super cynical, and especially for two movie two directors who have come off, the biggest series in film ever, essentially, to do something like this. It's pretty bold.
Yeah. And like they're easy targets, right, for critics. Yeah. So it's not necessarily surprising, but it is unfortunate that that's what we've kind of come to. I will say though that like there are some of those stylistic flourishes that just really hit me the wrong way. Like I didn't need them to rename Citibank Shitty Bank with the logos or any of that nonsense. That felt like just, I mean, almost felt like suddenly I was breaking into like a Community episode. And totally. It just, so like that amalgamation of styles, it seemed like that's what they wanted, but they didn't really think about like the effect of it, which is part of perhaps, the curse of being so wildly successful is that you're kind of blind to those things. And the fact that you're, veering so far away from the mainstream and doing things on your own, you don't necessarily have anybody, and you don't necessarily want to have anybody pointing out those kinds of misjudgments along the way.
I really want to comment on this deep dive you put up.
Oh yeah,
which is why most movies about the Iraq War failed from Collider. It is an interesting topic. Now, I haven't seen all of these movies without a doubt. I've seen a lot of them, but it is a war that has, I think, perplexed maybe artists in some way. I mean, has there been a definitive Iraq War movie like there was Apocalypse Now or Deer Hunter from Vietnam or Platoon? Is there anything out there in this list? And would you put Cherry up there in that world at all?
I mean, the Hurt Locker is the only one, I think.
Yeah, I think the only one that really connected. Yeah, I think it's a good one. I think The Messenger.
That'd be the other one, I'd say.
I thought that was really well done.
Right.
But most of them are not good.
No.
And there's just nothing. There's no. I like as much as this movie to me is more about the opioid crisis and maybe the crisis in Middle America of just the economy basically changing on people and the death of the middle class. That's what this movie to me is more about than say the Iraq War. Because ultimately, a war movie shouldn't just be about the guy who goes to fight the war. And like, let's be honest, the start of that war was pretty ridiculous and, very one-sided. So there's not really an insightful or wisdom that you can draw from a single U.S. troop going to fight. What does that even mean? Like, it'd be better from the Iraqis' point of view to get like a view of that war in a different way that had some meaning to it. I don't know. It's an interesting topic. I don't think that this really reaches the level of sort of a statement film necessarily about like, oh, this is what the Iraq War is about.
Yeah. Though I do think it could have been interesting, since these are TV guys, if they had considered like you could have treated one of the seasons of the show Cherry as the Iraq War. Like you could have separated those chapters of the film and really been able to get at something, which is another thing that kind of frustrated me with the film, is that like as soon as the war segment got done, then we're in this new world, and so it almost like the backfires in that it gives you reason to kind of put the previous chapter out of your mind, even though it's a journey film in which they should all interlock pretty well, but they don't. So oh well.
Well, I think I would say this: if you are like, if you're interested in films that sort of are tried new things and want to show a story in a different way than you normally see in a blockbuster film, absolutely see this movie. If you're not into sort of anything that's super gritty, drug use, violence, a really almost obscene or strange viewpoint, don't see this movie. It's pretty much that simple. Either you can handle the deep trip or you can't, and so if you can't, don't see the movie. What are we doing? It's my pick. Yeah, it's next week.
Yeah, tell us what you got, Dan.
15th anniversary of Darren Aronofsky's the polarizing sci-fi romance. Did you put that in there?
Yeah.
The Fountain. The Fountain. It's going to be on Stars. We might have a special guest. He's not confirmed yet. He might be busy. But
from
we might
Hollywood
have
itself.
from Hollywood itself, special guest. The Fountain. That should be a really fun one. It was a movie, I think, that was huge for us. I guess that would be college, right? Yeah, college.
Right after college. Yeah,
right after college, and I think it hit us a little bit differently back then than it does now. But that'll be fun. Thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.